You know, there's something weird about this outbreak that looks very different from SARS. They were bringing samples from bats 1,000 miles to the northeast, experimenting on them in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We're talking here about a lab that was 8 miles from the market where the outbreak was first detected. Is that a coincidence? We became more and more convinced that actually the lab leak is not only possible, but probable. They know what viruses they had in the lab. They won't tell us. Why not?
Who are they? What is their role? Who are they complicit with? Who pays their bills? What have we learned about the WHO, and has it gotten better or worse since Jan 2020?
The World Health Organization is extremely reassuring. We don't think it's spreading human to human. We think China has got this under control. Dr. Tedros goes to Beijing and he says publicly, words cannot express my admiration for what you're doing to control this virus. China was very clear. We put a lot of money into the WHO and we expect the WHO to do what we want. It wasn't possible for people to challenge each other because you've got these very big monolithic funding structures that fund basically the orthodoxy and they don't fund the heterodoxy.
You noticed that back in the 90s, there seemed to be some very objective science, but over the last 10 years, it all seemed to be kind of in a politically correct nature.
Nobody really talks about that. You know, this is an unknown. And science is about the unknown. It's not about the known, you know. Science isn't a catalogue of fact. It's a search for new mysteries to solve. We're finding this out not because we want to upset some political apple cart, but because we want to know. A lot of people in this virus debate are saying we can't find out because of the consequences. We're saying that's wrong. You must always find out the truth, whatever the consequences.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Matt Ridley, the science writer, journalist, and businessman. You spent 9 years as science editor for The Economist and are best known for writing about scientific discovery, the environment, and the economy. You served in the House of Lords from 2013 to 21 and are a fellow at the Royal Society of Literature and the Academy of Medical Sciences and an honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. As an author, your books include The Red Queen, Genome, and The Rational Optimist, which have sold over 1 million copies and been translated into 31 languages. Your latest book, Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19, co-authored with Alina Chan, explores how a leak from a laboratory in Wuhan is the most likely source of the virus. You believe it is vitally important that we understand how the pandemic began and that it requires urgent investigation, something mainstream scientists, journalists, and politicians have been reluctant to do. Matt, welcome to London Real.
Thank you very much, Brian. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you here. I think I want to start off with a quote from you. And you said, quote, "The saga will forever punctuate the history of humanity. It's led to the deaths of millions of people, sickened hundreds of millions, and dramatically changed the lives of almost every person on the planet." You go on to say, if we don't find out how this pandemic began, we're ill-equipped to know when, where, and how the next pandemic may start. We're almost 3 years since this happened. And I was wondering, maybe we just start, maybe take us back to 2020 and how you first even became aware that there was this virus out there.
Well, beginning of January 2020, I'm picking up the news reports just like everyone else. I didn't have any special inside knowledge about this, that there were people dying in Wuhan of a new form of viral pneumonia. And there was speculation, maybe it came from a market very quickly. There's a market where a lot of cases were identified early on. So they actually used the diagnostic criteria. They said, have you been to the market? If so, you might have this disease, which makes it very difficult later to interpret how important the market was. And they're basing that on what happened in the case of SARS, because this is clearly a close relative of SARS. End of January, 23rd of January, the scientists in the Wuhan Institute of Virology published the genome of the virus for the first time. And that's a really interesting moment because they say it's closely related to a bat virus. Now, I was catching up on this. I hadn't followed the SARS story very closely. I knew that in the case of SARS in 2003, it had been palm civets that had infected people in markets in southern China, and they'd very quickly established a chain there with food handlers and animal vendors being infected early. So I assumed that we were seeing the same sort of picture here. But the fact that it was bats, which they eventually had found out a few years ago that SARS originally came from bats, it made sense. The SARS-like coronaviruses are all, as far as we can make out, naturally resident in horseshoe bats. No other kind of bat. There's about 100 species of horseshoe bats. There's a lot in China. It looks like you get sarbecoviruses, as they're called, SARS-like coronaviruses, originally from horseshoe bats. So yes, they said, the Wuhan Institute of Virology said, we found a closely related virus in bats. It's called RATG13. And it was previously discovered. They gave no link, they gave no reference. And I went online. I was researching articles about this topic, and I went online to find, okay, where did they find RATG13? Under what circumstances? In which bat? At what date? Is what I wanted to know. And I couldn't find any reference to that phrase in any online source at all. And so I wrote to the Wuhan scientists. They didn't reply. I wrote to some other people. They didn't know anymore. It was nearly 2 months before we discovered that the reason for that is that they'd been using a different name for that virus right up until the year before. And that may or may not have been intended to confuse us, but it certainly did confuse us and set us back. Because once we knew the name they'd been using the year before, and it was a woman called Rossana Segreto who first spotted this, that this thing had exactly the same sequence as a virus called RA4991. Once we knew that, we were able to find out where they'd collected 4991. And it turned out to be in a mine shaft in southern Yunnan, well over 1,000 miles from Wuhan, where there'd been an outbreak that had killed 3 people and sickened 3 others very badly. They eventually recovered. So this was a human. No, sorry, they didn't get the virus from the humans. They got it from bats in the same mine shaft a year after the outbreak. Well, this is quite important information. Because
that happened back in 2012.
The outbreak was in 2012.
Right.
The Wuhan Institute of Virology went back to that site 7 times over the next 2 years to try and find out what the bats were carrying, because they hadn't been able to identify the virus in the people, to find out what viruses the bats were carrying, because they suspected this was the first ever case of a SARS-like virus infecting people directly from a bat. That's what they thought had happened. We know that from a thesis at Kunming Medical University. So, so there's the start of an interesting trail here. What do we know? How do we know it? Why aren't we getting the full story up front from the Wuhan Institute of Virology? But at the time, I'm not even thinking it comes from a lab. And indeed, people were asking me, because they know I'm interested in molecular biology and infectious diseases and things like that, and colleagues in Parliament were asking me, I'm hearing that it might have come out of a lab in Wuhan. Is that true? And I'm saying, no, it's not true. It's definitely not true, because I've read this paper in the middle of March in Nature Medicine called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, which says that we can rule that out. Now, I don't fully follow the arguments yet. I haven't gone into the detail, but these guys seem to be serious virologists, and they're saying, no, it didn't come out of a lab. So that's good enough for me. Well, it shouldn't have been good enough for me. It wasn't good enough for me because over the next couple of months, I start to dig a bit deeper. I find out this story about the Mojiang mine shaft, the connection with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the fact that they were bringing samples from bats 1,000 miles to the northeast, the distance from Miami to New York or London to Rome, it's not next door, and experimenting on them in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And then I found out the experiments they were doing on them. They were synthesizing viruses through a technique called reverse genetics. They were swapping genes in and out of viruses to test how dangerous these viruses were, etc. And then suddenly, in May of 2020, a paper appears online, a draft paper, a preprint, from a team of 3 scientists, one of whom was called Alina Chan, and she was the moving force behind this paper, saying, there's something weird about this outbreak that looks very different from SARS. This virus was very well adapted to human beings from the start. It didn't evolve very much in the first couple of months. That's surprising. Normally, if you've just jumped out of a bat and this is your first experience inside a human body, you've got to make some pretty rapid genetic switches to get good at infecting these new hosts called humans. Not least because in bats, this is an intestinal virus. In humans, it's a respiratory virus. So you're dealing with the lungs of a completely different, quite distinct mammal species. So you need to evolve like crazy to get good at this, right? To get infectious, to get, good at replicating and so on. This one doesn't seem to have done that. It seems to have been ready to go from the outset. Now that suggested to Alina Chan that we need to take seriously the possibility that it might have been the result of a laboratory accident, that it had been in human cells in the lab as part of an experiment, and it had jumped. At the same time, that very same week in May of 2020, the head of the Centers for Disease Control in Beijing, a man named George Gao, announced that the market was not the site where it began. He was confident it was not. Well, since then, we've had American scientists saying we're confident it is, but George Gao hasn't changed his tune. He published something again in 2021 saying, no, I really don't think it did start in that market. I think the market was an amplifying event. It was a super spreader event. Somebody went to the market and gave it to a bunch of other people. But we've looked for it in animals in the market and we haven't found it. We can't find an infected animal in that market. We can find samples on the doorknobs, on the countertops, in the sewage, things like that, but they're the human version of the virus. So those two things, the fact that it was well adapted to humans from the start, the fact that it didn't seem to have come from the market, and then behind this, the knowledge that it had actually, the closest relative had been collected a long way and way, but brought to Wuhan, made me reopen my mind about whether or not this might be a laboratory leak. And within a few months, I was collaborating with Alina Chan on writing this book, and both of us remained agnostic. We didn't know what the answer was. But as time went on and we turned up more evidence, we became more and more convinced that actually the lab leak is not only possible, but probable, and that it needs to be taken very seriously. And yet we hit a brick wall with the scientific establishment. They kept saying, no, nothing to see here. We don't want to discuss it. We don't want to have debates about it. This is, a conspiracy theory or whatever. No, it's not. It's a distinct possibility.
And you have been inside uncovering and writing through and about the scientific community for decades. Did it surprise you to get that kind of reaction?
Well, I have to say, I'm a huge fan of science. My whole career has been about how wonderful science is. It's I think the human species' greatest achievement, bar none, is the knowledge that has been acquired through the scientific method. But I've been becoming gradually more and more disillusioned at the way the scientific establishment behaves like a church, resists new ideas, pursues consensus rather than debate, and more and more spends its time looking for confirmatory evidence rather than challenging itself, which is the definition, according to people like Carl Sagan. That's what science does. It says, okay, nice idea. What evidence can we find that would disprove this idea? Not what evidence is consistent with this idea. And it seems to me that in recent years, science has become more and more like that. But I have to say, this episode, the last 3 years, have made me very, very disillusioned with science as an institution. Not with science as a philosophy, but with science as an institution.
Yeah, I have to agree to a certain extent. Now, in April of 2020, you wrote a paper for the Wall Street Journal, I think, talking about the concept of it being spread from a bat, and you kind of went into what was being told at the time. And then within a month or two, you were ready, or you wrote something saying, I'm now not sure, or it could have come from a lab.
Exactly that. I wrote an article called The Bats Behind the Pandemic for the Wall Street Journal, and in it I said, we can be pretty sure it didn't come out of a lab, but we do know it came from a bat, and the question is, how did it get from a bat cave, probably 1,000 miles away, to Wuhan? And within a month or two, I'm saying, look, there are 4 ways this could have happened. There are lots of ways, but there are 4 obvious ways. One is that there's some animal being sold in the market in Wuhan that has come from a long way away and that somehow was stored in a cave where it picked up a bat disease, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what happened in the case of SARS, as far as we can make out. The second is that there's a human being who lives in a rural area, goes into a bat cave to harvest bat guano as fertilizer. He catches a train to Wuhan, he infects people. That the vector from Yunnan to Wuhan is a human being. The third is that human being is a scientist who's gone into that bat cave not to collect bat guano, but to collect blood samples and nasal mucosal samples from bats. And that's been happening on a far bigger scale in the last 10 years in Yunnan than it has in the previous 10 years. Why? Because they were on the trail of the original SARS. They wanted to find out where the original SARS came from, et cetera, et cetera. So they mounted a ton of expeditions to caves and mine shafts all over Yunnan to collect samples from horseshoe bats and to analyze the viruses they found in them. And they found something like 630 new types of coronavirus. And of that, about 100 were probably SARS-like coronaviruses. And of those 100, 9 were like SARS-CoV-2, the cause of COVID. All 9 came from, this is at the beginning of the pandemic, the 9 closest relatives of that virus were found in that one mine shaft in Mojiang County in Yunnan. And the only people collecting bat virus samples in that area and taking them elsewhere were the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There's not a Beijing institute doing the same thing. There was one Beijing expedition early on, but it was mostly looking at other animals, actually, not bats. It's not as if every city in China has this kind of lab. The only lab in China that is working on SARS-like viruses, SARS-Bika viruses, is the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or at least by far the biggest is that institute. So, and by the way, you often hear people say, oh yeah, but come on, the reason that lab is in Wuhan is because that's where the viruses are. No, the viruses are in Yunnan, they're 1,000 miles away. They have looked for SARS-like viruses in the bats around Wuhan, and there are horseshoe bats around Wuhan, and they've never found one. They've found other coronaviruses, but not SARS-Bika viruses, which are the kind we're looking for. So, the geographical coincidence here is pretty striking, and I'll give you an analogy. In 2007, here in the UK, foot and mouth disease broke out on a farm at Pirbright in Surrey, and 13 miles down the road from that farm was the world's leading reference laboratory for foot and mouth disease virus. Is that a coincidence? turned out, no, it is not a coincidence. Nobody said, well, that just must be a coincidence. No big deal. There's probably nothing to see here. They said, whoa, this is way too close to that lab. We need to check if something's gone wrong there. And within a week or two, they had figured out that a contractor had been at the lab mending a broken pipe and had gone straight to the farm that then became infected. So we're talking here about a lab that was 8 miles from the market where the outbreak was first detected, in the case of COVID, and that is the leading lab in the world for working on these kinds of viruses.
So we were having conversations about this in April, May, and June of 2020, and asking similar questions. Everyone was confused, asking questions about masks, about distancing, about the economy, Great Barrington Declaration. Martin Kulldorff was on the show. And other people asking about if it came from a lab in Wuhan. Now, the first few got us taken off these tech platforms. Mentioning Wuhan would have gotten you sent to the loony bin at that point. I mean, that was almost code red. And again, I got an engineering degree from MIT. I mean, science as I know it is that we question things, we talk about ideas, we get them out in the open. I always used to joke, Matt, that the flat earthers on YouTube remained. The flat earth videos on YouTube were there. And if you want to watch them, you can watch them and you can debate them, and that's okay. Right. But anything asking questions about the virus or the origin virus was silenced. And the reason I bring it up is because in your investigation, there's a lot of powers involved here, from the Chinese Communist government to Fauci in America and pharmaceutical companies, et cetera. So how does this unfold? And this becomes very not about science very quickly, right?
That's true. Alina's a practicing scientist. I've been a journalist most of my career, although I started as a scientist. We brought different skills to this. She could interrogate the science in great depth. And I, to some extent, was interested in just the simple journalistic practice of following trails to see where they led. Now, what was quite interesting is that, as you say, turning to Western scientists and saying, please can you tell me what you're finding out about the origin of this new disease that's killing people, was pretty useless. There was almost nobody interested. There was a little bit going on. As you say, it was very hard to talk about it on social media. Twitter was an exception. You could talk about it on Twitter, and that turned out to be vital. Facebook was censoring this. But if you contacted mainstream scientists, and I did, I contacted senior people at the Royal Society and others and said, what do you think? And they would say, no, we can rule that out. So, well, why can you rule it out? Well, it's just been ruled out. You don't need to worry about the why. We understand these things, you don't. It's not quite what they were saying, but it wasn't far off. So the scientists were not much help. The journalists were not much help, with a few honourable exceptions. Ian Birrell on the Mail, John Sudworth at the BBC, who tried to go to this Mojiang site. Most journalists said, no, that's a conspiracy theory. We're not even going to investigate it. Well, if you're a sniffing newshound wanting to make a career, why not, have a go at this? It's a really interesting question. How did this pandemic start? So that was disappointing. And the science journalists, worst of all, they would just say in a very patronizing tone, you don't know what you're talking about. I work for Nature or New Scientist or something like that. And I can tell you, I've talked to my friend, Dr. Fauci, and he says no. Well, that isn't quite good enough. The point of science is you don't take arguments from authority, you take arguments from evidence, right? If you want arguments from authority, join the Catholic Church. That's the way it works. So the scientists weren't much good, the journalists weren't much good, politicians weren't much good, they weren't finding out very much. The spooks weren't much good. I mean, I had conversations with senior intelligence officials in the US who said to me in conspiratorial tones, we've just found out the following. And on one occasion I said, not only have I read that in the media, I've written that in the media. Is that all you've got? So that wasn't much help. The heroes for us of the story were what we call the internet sleuths. And these were a bunch of completely random people who got interested in this story and turned out to have the forensic skills to pursue rabbit holes in the internet and find out where they led. There's a guy in India called the Seeker. His real name is Jeet Ray, and but he goes under the name of the Seeker. He's quite happy for us to tell the world who he is in our book. But he's a young man in Bhubaneswar who, as he puts it, knows how to use search engines. Well, that sounds pretty simple. But what he means by that is he got hold of some login details for Chinese websites where academic theses were stored. And he found some goldmine information. He found these 9 viruses 8 of these 9 viruses that they weren't talking about. He found the thesis that described what happened to those 6 guano miners, 3 of whom died at the Mojiang mine, and so on. So then there's a guy in Spain called Francisco Ribera, he's basically a professional auditor. He knows how to audit companies, right? And he knows that what you do is you look for missing invoices, to see whether or not somebody's fiddling their expenses or whatever it might be. So he starts to compile what he calls a big Sudoku, which is every serial number of every virus that the Wuhan Institute of Virology has collected, and where they collected it and what the genome of the virus looks like, etc. Now, some of this stuff is published. It's dumped on genetic databases and other things. Others you can infer from other things, or you can find it from secret sources or something. But eventually he's compiling an itinerary for these guys. On what date were they at which cave in Yunnan? And which serial numbers correspond to that expedition to that cave? And he eventually says, hang on, they've collected 8 other SARS-like viruses from the Mojiang mine shaft that they've not told us about, and they're closely related to SARS-CoV-2. In fact, they're the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th most closely related at the time virus to SARS-CoV-2. So, Francisco is another very good example of he was doing this in his spare time. Both of these guys live with their mums. This isn't, to start with, everybody said, the Seeker must be something to do with CIA or Indian intelligence. It certainly wasn't true then. It may be now, for all I know. But there's another guy called Barbal Elephant. I don't actually know his real name, but he turned out to be vital on a couple of issues. Gilles Demoneuf is a French guy living in New Zealand who found out an extraordinary amount. And a Brit called Charles Small found out that the database of viruses that the lab had in storage, either physical samples or sequences in the computer, they had this huge database, 22,000 entries, went offline at 2 a.m. On the 12th of September 2019. Now, it came back on briefly in February, but not accessible from outside, only accessible within the lab. Most of it was password protected anyway. Now, that's their complete record of their viruses. They've published a lot of the viruses they've worked on up till 2016. They've published almost nothing since then of viruses they've collected since 2016. So if they want to exonerate themselves in that lab, if they want to say, look, we had nothing to do with this, the easiest thing for them to do is to publish that database, say, look, there's our database, there's no SARS-2-like viruses in it, case closed. I mean, that would blow us out the water. Why don't they do that? I've challenged them again and again on this, and the answer comes back, because you might hack it. What does that mean? If you've published something, you don't have to hack it. It's a sort of meaningless remark. So, it's possible there's an innocent explanation for why they won't publish it. They're just so furious at being asked that they think it's impertinent of the world to demand to see that. And anyway, they want to keep things secret because they want to publish about them in the future. Well, hang on. North of 10 million people are dead. Don't you think we ought to be as transparent with each other as we can about what we know about this virus to try and try and help find out what happened. So, that database, to me, is as powerful a point as one can make. They know what viruses they had in the lab up till the end of 2019. They won't tell us. Why not?
Right. And that was September 19. That's early.
Yes, that's surprisingly early.
Right.
And
also there was some strange military games and things happening around there before. I mean, you went full sleuth, but maybe you can fill us in on some of the other interesting and coincidental events that happened at the end of 19.
Yeah, so October 2019, the World Military Games took place in Wuhan. And a lot of athletes went from all over the world. And there are persistent reports that a lot of the athletes got some quite nasty respiratory infections while they were there. It's been very difficult to get the authorities in America and Canada and European countries to go back and test these guys or test any samples they took at the time. You'd think with athletes there might be samples on, in fridges and things, in freezers. And to see whether, it's just possible someone did get infected with this kind of virus then. But it doesn't seem likely because it really does erupt in December. The number of cases explodes in December. And for it to have been just ticking over in October and November is unlikely. Now, the most likely earliest case is 17th of November. That's when, according to documents that was leaked to the South China Morning Post and then scrubbed and denied, but it looked pretty good data to me, that's when they said that the earliest case they'd been able to find of someone. Now, what was going on in September, October, November? We've got these World Military Games. And by the way, they did some security exercises around these games, one of which was that somebody, to test the police response and so on if something went wrong during these games. One of them was a nuclear incident. The other was that a new coronavirus comes in. Wow, it's sort of weird. And now, is that a coincidence? I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. September feels way too early for there to have been a leak. So I don't think that they took that database down because they knew they'd already had the leak. I think they took it down because it was around the end of a grant period, and so there was a sort of audit coming up of the lab by the authorities. So that they would have taken it down preparatory to this audit with a view to putting it up again when the audit was over. Now, the Republicans on one of the Senate committees looked into this and found some chatter on internal Communist Party websites from within the lab in the autumn of 2019 that seems to have reached some kind of pretty alarming level. And it's not entirely easy to interpret, but it looks like there was biosafety concerns in October 2019. Something had gone wrong. There'd been an accident or a mistake or something, and the authorities in Beijing were very upset about it, and there was a lot of soul searching. Now, that might have been a leak. It might not have been. It might have been just some procedures not being followed and somebody caught them. It might have been something to do with this audit I was talking about. So, again, we don't know. But, you've got the database going down in September, you've got the World Military Games in October, you've got the chatter inside the Communist Party website in the lab in October. You've got the first case in the middle of November, as far as we can tell. You've got a bunch of cases in December, and probably about 250 cases before the end of December. So that's the period when something's happening, and we don't entirely know what.
And there were two doctors in Wuhan that noticed this, I think, at two different hospitals. One later died of the disease. I remember reading a little bit about that at the time. What did we learn from them? Because I think also the Communist Party was a bit slow to maybe censor some of the information coming out of those two gentlemen.
Yeah, that's right. In January 2020, there's quite a lot of chat on Chinese social media from within the hospitals about what doctors are seeing, what they're finding, and in particular, this ophthalmologist, Dr. Wen Liang, I think I've got his name right, he warns his friends and colleagues, there's a new viral pneumonia in our hospital. We're not supposed to talk about it, but watch it, take precautions. Now by the middle of February, he's dead of COVID, poor chap, and he's young, he's in his 30s.
33, right?
Yeah. So that's kind of surprising. But the point is, at the end of January, he is subjected to a vicious dressing down by the party for having put this stuff on social media, on an internal chat to his colleagues. Not he's not posted it on Twitter or something. He's circulated to his friends. Watch it. There's a virus on the loose in the hospital. And the document he had to sign saying, I was wrong to do this, was brutal. It's nasty stuff, as it were. And he's not the only one. There are people being basically arrested for having said things about this virus at that time. And there's very clearly that the regime is trying to keep a lid on the information in January because they're pretending that it's under control. And they're claiming right up to the middle of January, we got this sorted, it was a little outbreak, no problem, it's over. There's been no new cases for 10 days. They said that at one point, that just wasn't true. There's no evidence of human-to-human transmission. They said that right up until the middle of January, and the World Health Organization echoed them on that. And by then, even the Taiwanese knew that wasn't true. There was information coming out saying not healthcare workers are getting infected who are handling patients and things like that. So, of course, there's human-to-human transmission. Not every case has gone to the market and bought a bamboo rat for dinner. This isn't what's happening. People are getting it from people. And the Chinese New Year mega banquet in Wuhan with, I can't remember how many, 100,000 people attending it, goes ahead at the end of January.
And everyone goes back home all across the country.
And everyone travels all over the world for that holiday. Right. And, so a chance is missed to nip this in the bud because of the way the regime reacted.
Could something have been done?
Yes, I think if on the 31st of December, which is essentially the date that the medical authorities in Wuhan wake up to the fact that something's happening, if on that date they had said, let's share all the information we can, not only inside China but with the world, let's find all the cases, let's take immense precautions to isolate them, I think the whole thing could have been over in a couple of weeks. It's very infectious, so possibly not, but there is undoubtedly a possibility that that's true.
Could have been contained.
It could have been contained.
As opposed to super spread. The Chinese New Year's was the super spreading event.
Par excellence.
Probably that's the most spreading event of any holiday of the year is that one.
Now, it's possible, and we keep getting reports from Italy that there's evidence of the virus or antibodies to the virus in sewage in Italy from before December, from November or December. So and there were a lot of connections between Wuhan and northern Italy through the textile industry. It's possible that it was already out of China before they even detected it in China. But the reason I don't myself think that we can be sure about that is because picking up an antibody to SARS-CoV-2 in sewage in northern Italy may not tell you as much as you think, because there are 4 other coronaviruses that infect people all the time and cause versions of the common cold, and you get cross-reactivity of antibodies. So you might just be picking up the background radiation, as it were, of coronavirus immune reactions in human beings.
You mentioned the WHO, who at the time was just echoing whatever China said. When most of the public hears about the World Health Organization for the first time, we hear these big words and, we see these logos and we just assume they're someone to trust like any major government. Who are they? What is their role? Who are they complicit with? Who pays their bills? What have we learned about the WHO, and has it gotten better or worse since Jan 2020?
Well, I wrote an article critical of the WHO back in 2014 after they made a hash of the response to Ebola. In that case, they were reluctant to declare a problem because they were under pressure from the countries in West Africa where the problem was happening, not to make too much of a fuss about it. And they admitted that. They investigated themselves. Dr. David Nabarro led an investigation, and it was a very, very self-critical report. And it said, look, we shouldn't be doing that. And, when Ebola is taking off in West Africa, the Director General of the WHO goes to a conference on tobacco control, not to a conference on Ebola. Do you see what I mean? There was that kind of stuff going on. So I had my reservations about whether the WHO was fit for mission leading up to this. They had elected a new Director General, Dr. Tedros from Ethiopia, former Health Minister and Foreign Minister of Ethiopia and former Marxist, and very much China's candidate. China had gone around the world saying to all the countries, particularly in Africa, that it deals with, where it's funding infrastructure projects and things, it said, look, please vote for Dr. Tedros, and if you do, we might be able to give you a bit more money for your projects and things like that. And so that was basically how he got the job. He was somewhat beholden to China. And China had become a much bigger donor to the WHO. It's not quite as big as Britain, but it's still a big donor. The US is obviously, was the biggest until Donald Trump stopped funding it briefly, but there we are. And but China was very clear. We put a lot of money into the WHO, and we expect the WHO to do what we want. So they kicked Taiwan out of the World Health Assembly, for example, at China's behest. They recognized Chinese traditional medicine as a viable form of medicine in 2018 at China's behest. Now, some of it's good stuff, there's acupuncture and things, which is not bad, but some of it is quack medicine of the worst kind, which encourages trade in endangered wildlife. Eating pangolin scales, for example, you might as well eat your fingernails. It does not improve your health. So that was a bit anti-scientific, I think, to be fair. And then when this breaks out, the World Health Organization is extremely reassuring. We don't think it's spreading human to human. We think China has got this under control. And in January, Dr. Tedros goes to Beijing and he says publicly, words cannot express my admiration for what you're doing to control this virus. Well, those aren't quite the right words for a regime that is persecuting Dr. Wen, putting in jail people who've posted stuff on social media, refusing to disseminate information about what's happening, etc., etc. Those aren't the words I would have used, put it like that.
And how did their behavior continue over the following year?
Well,
they flip-flopped on a lot of issues as well, didn't they?
I mean, it became a farce in the end because the World Health Organization said, we're going to put together a team to go and look into the origin of this. And we all said, great, fine, who's going to be on it? And they said, well, that's up to the Chinese who's going to be on it. What? Yeah, the Chinese have veto over who's on it. Half the team will be Chinese, but the Westerners will also be vetoed by the Chinese. We'll say who you can send. Right. And it took them 6 months to develop the terms of reference for that visit, that investigation. And when the visit finally happened, the Western members of the team suddenly found their visas weren't ready and the whole thing had to be delayed. And then they got to Wuhan in the January of 2021, and they had to spend 2 weeks in quarantine in the hotel. And then they had about 10 days of visits to various facilities in Wuhan. These included a day spent at the museum to celebrate the success of the regime in defeating COVID-19. Right? Was that really a useful use of their time? It included 3 hours at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, at the new campus, not the old campus, which is where the key work had been done, but never mind. Visiting the biosafety level 4 lab, which was not the one where this work had been done, but never mind.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.